Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Deep Edge Podcast. I'm your host, Ray Mota, CEO and Principal Analyst for ACG Research. And in this podcast, I'm excited to be joined by Jamie Dobson, who's the author for Visionaries, Rebels, and Machines. And Jamie's work is great because he talks a lot about, some of the triumphs and pitfalls of technology from the early stages of the internet to today's revolution. So I'm excited about having him on. We're going to tackle into some areas that I think is in everyone's mind related to not getting carried away with all the AI hype and exploring Amara's law. And I think from this point of view, our audience should get a lot of benefits about addressing different parts of AI, from fostering of culture to psychological safety to upscaling your team and managing expectations at every level. And later on, getting into the nuts and bolts of build versus buy, especially when it gets to relate it to AI, and why sometimes going slow today means going faster tomorrow. So let's dive in. Hey, Jamie, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Hey, thank you, Ray. Good to be here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it there. And I think this is a good topic. I'm really excited. I know how busy you are and stuff like this. Now, I talked in the beginning about, you being the author of a few books, the founder of Container Solutions and stuff like that. But I want to get into some of the discussions about this visionary rebels and machines that I think is an interesting topic. So I'm excited to have you on.
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, thanks for letting me come on and speak about some of these ideas that I've been developing. And actually, I seem to be hitting some high notes right now because the response has been overwhelmingly positive. So I wondered if it's just an issue of timing, but right now it's on everybody's minds. How do you get smart people to use existing technologies to develop new technologies, specifically AI? So thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I think it's spot on there, right? I mean, I think what I want to do then is maybe break it up into strategic question technicals and get into some of the cultural stuff. Now, if we get started from a big picture perspective, right? It's AI hype versus reality, right? And we've seen this with a lot of other technologies. Now, do you think we're getting a little carried away with this AI hype, or what are the bigger opportunities that we might be missing while this race for AI and everybody's jumping on this bandwagon?
I think we're getting carried away and we're not getting carried away enough.
Mhm.
And I think this is an issue that leaders and managers have often misdiagnosed the context and not quite sure what's happening. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have people spending a mountain of money on AI, budgets for research, for example, or budgets for the cloud have been cut because people are exploring artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not sure that's the best use of their resources. So, for example, many of those companies, they're not particularly psychologically safe. The management's in a bit of a mess. And actually, the data is all over the place. So it would be wiser to sort your teams out and sort your data out before thinking, well, how can I use large language models to, make our processes more efficient? So in some cases, yeah, they've sort of they're racing ahead too quickly. But in other cases, people are downplaying the importance of artificial intelligence. Oh, it won't affect our department. It's not going to affect our company or our industry. But if you go all the way back to the 1980s and Reaganomics, just at the turn, as the 70s turned into the 80s, Intel said, there's no threat from Japanese industry. It's absolutely not going to affect American industry. And so they downplayed the threat. Now that's happening right now. If you don't prepare capabilities for artificial intelligence and you don't prepare your workforce, then you're going to be left, well, with egg on your chin, as we say in the UK. So I think in some cases people are doing too much in the wrong area. In other areas, people who should be worried are not worried. And I guess only a very small number of companies are hitting the right notes presently.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to remember that UK phrase next time I'm
Egg on
there.
your chin. I don't know what the US equivalent would
I
be.
don't know, egg in your face or something like that. Yeah, yeah, egg in your face. But in the past, this is good. You've talked about Amara's law before, right? That we kind of like overestimate tech in the short term, but underestimated in the long term, right? How do you see that playing out with AI right now?
Well, if Amara's law is correct, and I think it roughly is, then we should expect to see history repeat itself, for example, with a microprocessor, later the PC, and then the arrival of the web. So typically, so Amara's law, just for your
Mhm.
listeners, basically states that we tend to overestimate what technology can do in the short term, but then we underestimate what it might do in the long term. Now, Gartner's hype cycle is very much based on this observation. Now, when the web came along, you might remember pets.com,
Yes,
and
of course. Yeah.
everybody went absolutely nuts and said, okay,
Yeah.
everything's going to go online. All the bricks and mortar stores are going to become clicks and mortar stores.
Yeah.
But what people really got wrong is that a movie can be dematerialized and broadcast as bits in a stream, which is why we can watch it on television or the internet or our computers. But you cannot send pet food down a Wi-Fi, no matter what your bandwidth is. That's never going to happen. So the realities of what could and couldn't be done with e-commerce and web-based businesses was misunderstood. So then after the hype, of course, people got really frustrated. But away from the headlines and the fear and the excitement, researchers, practitioners, they get busy. And what they do is they seek out real practical use cases.
Mm.
Now, classic examples of that would be eBay. What a wonderful way to use the internet to be the arbitrator between sellers and buyers. Another one, of course, was Uber. Now, you may or may not like Uber. You may disagree with the way it operates as a business, but ultimately, that used web technologies and mobile applications specifically really, really well. And of course, that came, what, 10, 12, 15 years after the web first arrived. Now, back to your question about AI, I think the heat around LLMs is going to cool down. It is
Mhm.
hyped. It is hyped up. My wife just redesigned our garden with ChatGPT. Now, the garden any good? No, compared to a professional landscaper, it's probably rubbish, but it's way more than we could have done on our own, and it's well within budget.
Right.
So I think what's happening right now is away from this podcast and behind the scenes, real researchers and practitioners are looking for use cases. My team at Container Solutions have found a handful, and over time, those use cases are going to enter into our lives like Uber and WhatsApp entered into our lives about 10 or 15 years ago. And it will have impact, a real impact.
No, no, I think it's good because we mentioned Uber and things like this that have been innovative. I remember working in Wall Street where if you had one of those private car services, you were looked at as very successful, right?
Right.
Now you could just request it in Uber. So that balance of class and technology leveling up the playing field, I think it's great from a long-term impact, right? And one thing you touched on, which is good, which is part of a question I was going to ask, is about lessons learned from history, right? About the dot-com crash and what are the lessons that we can learn that could help us? But what are those lessons that we could help us better understand where AI is heading, right? Any particular thoughts on some of the history? Because the pet.com and all those I think are great. But for our audience, what are some of those lessons that we can help pinpoint and spearhead moving forward with AI?
I think it's important. The real lesson from history is right now, all chatter about AI, because it's already arrived, but only in the very beginning, most talk about AI is either prediction or it's misunderstood, etc., etc. So if you really pick the big landmarks from our industry, so for example, let's start with electricity. You want to go all the way back? Let's start with electricity.
Mhm.
Edison patented the grid and the technology that made it, it was made up of, and the incandescent light bulb. Nobody had any idea that very quickly we would be plugging in ions, we would be plugging in radios only about 20 years later, 30 years later, and the radio became ubiquitous. Nobody could predict that. Once a general purpose technology is in the hands of users, it's the users who find applications for it. This is 100% what's going to happen. And now, who will those users be? Will they be a lone teenager messing around with an AI and a biohacking kit? That's a bit scary.
Mm-hmm.
Will it be a writer or a poet working with LLMs to produce a new type of art? So at this point, we don't know for sure what applications we're going to find, but what is certainly going to happen is users are going to be out there playing, experimenting, and coming up with ideas that right now we struggle to imagine.
Yeah, no, I think this is good from that right now. One thing that we talk about, or at least specifically that you address, is building for the long game, right? Um, if AI's real impact is years away, right? How should companies start preparing today? You know, what should they be focusing on to make sure that they're ready for this AI if it does take off? Because as we talked even earlier before we started broadcasting that, you know, there's a lot of these large AI projects, they haven't received the outcome, right, that expected, right? And they're expecting these short-term goals and stuff like that. So any color on that?
Well, I think it won't be years away. AI is here right now, and we're going to see genuine changes in 12 to 18 months.
Okay.
Anybody who works in technology right now and wants to change job are struggling because the job market is it's not hot right now, and that's because many companies think that artificial intelligence will be able to do the job of skilled people. So
Right.
I don't think it's years away. But in my opinion, there's a few things that companies need to think about, and I like to talk about these things in categories.
Mhm.
So there are basically no regret moves. These are things you can do that no matter what happens in the future, you're not going to regret them. Now, the second thing we can think of are experiments. We can take experiments right now that will prepare us for a future that we cannot predict. And the third level is if you really have uh, a big bet in the future, then you can start to do research and development and actually make big bets. Now, if you want me to, Ray, I can go through examples of each of
Yeah,
these three,
please do. Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah.
right? So a classic no regret move would be any team right now that's programming, or for example, I tell you what, you like this, Ray.
Mhm.
Roy, sorry,
Ray.
need my
No,
glasses on.
Ray's fine. That's my name. Yeah, Ray. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Ray.
Yeah.
Sorry. You'll have to edit that bit out. Shall I try that
Yeah,
again?
no, no, I like it. It's real. No editing here.
The problem is, it's because I took my reading glasses off for a second. Uh, so a no regret move is basically something you can do that, you know, doesn't matter what happens, you're going to get some value for that. So one of my colleagues at Container Solutions, he puts the transcript of our podcast through an LLM and it summarizes the key points for us. Well, that's a great
Nice.
use case. Now,
Right.
that's not going to break the bank, but in a company with 10,000 people, summarizing information or using ChatGPT to do that, great. Another one, co-pilots for computer programmers. Co-pilots cannot write code like a talented computer programmer can, but they can quickly generate test data. So presently, I'm speaking to all my customers and saying, sure, let your team experiment with co-pilots for Terraform, for cloud
Mhm.
infrastructure, for test data. The machines will get better, and you need to know how to integrate that into your process. Exactly like 200 years ago, you know, we had improvements in the spinning jenny.
Right.
It didn't completely replace the skilled weavers of the day, but it was one part of the process that was helped by automation. So this is what I call a no regret move.
Right.
Now, another one that helps you prepare for the future that you cannot predict. Literally 200 meters from me, there is a supermarket in London. It's from Aldi. Aldi are a German company, but they're very big here in the UK. I love them. They're very popular because the fresh fruit and vegetables are awesome.
Mhm.
Now, there's a supermarket right here. You can walk in, put whatever you like in your basket, and walk out. That's it. Right? He knows who you are. He knows what you've paid for. It will deduct the money later. Now that shop's not cost nothing. What's it going to 10 million, 100 million? But if you look at it in terms of their revenue and their profitability, it's actually a small amount, a few million. Now, if this artificially intelligent supermarket works, that is an experiment that they can learn from and they can scale throughout England and then, of course, throughout Europe. So that's an experiment where you're not quite sure what's happening in the future, but you're willing to spend 5, 10 million, you're willing to bet and
Right.
then learn the lessons from it. Then, of course, you get to the big bets. This is the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Mhm.
Xerox invested hundreds of millions of dollars into inventing the electronic office. Unbelievably, they invented the personal computer,
Right.
but then they messed up their
Yeah,
go-to-market
they sure
before.
did.
They sure did, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And then Steve Jobs swept in and then he's
yeah.
gazumped with the Apple II. But Microsoft invested heavily in OpenAI and Google, of course, bought DeepMind. These are big bets.
Right.
However, I will remind people, your listeners, the cloud was invented not with a big bet, but with small incremental changes. The team at Amazon were like, well, we need to automate how we provision computers because it's driving us mad. Let's do that. And then they said, well, actually, now we can order computer infrastructure through a web front end. And then Jeff Bezos and his assistant Colin went to, I think it was a conference in 2005.
Mhm.
And up on the stage, the chief executive of Flickr said, 50% of our time is spent scaling our infrastructure.
Mm.
Now think about that for a
I
second.
know. That's crazy. Yeah.
50% of your time is basically faffing around with computers. It's almost like fixing your plumbing and your
Right.
central heating. And only 50% of your time goes into product and customer service.
Yeah.
So Jeff Bezos is in the crowd. He looks at Colin and Colin looks at Jeff. And they say, my goodness, we could do they had a term for it in Amazon. They called it undifferentiated heavy lifting. They
Mhm.
said we could do Flickr's undifferentiated heavy lifting for them. And then Flickr could just get busy. And then all of a sudden it dawned on them, holy smokes, we've got a business, this computer thing we've invented, this cloud thing
Right.
that might help all these other e-commerce shops.
Yeah.
So AWS didn't have any competitors for 7 years
I
before
know. It's
Microsoft and
crazy.
Google arrived. Small incremental changes, dedicated, a team that was dedicated to innovation, and a boss, quite frankly, in Bezos, who was a bit mad. They
Mhm.
called it doing a nutter when
Right.
Jeff throws a tantrum, but he was so frustrated with the state of their infrastructure, they invented the cloud, and in doing so, invented a new industry based on simple changes. So that's how companies can prepare. No regret moves, experiments, and some big bets if they've got an idea where the future's going.
Yeah, no, I think your example with Amazon Cloud or AWS, I think it's a great example because I think it did more than just create a new industry, right? It changed of innovation cycles of startups, right? It used to be that if I wanted to start a company, I had to go through all the steps of provisioning, setting up an IP address, spending for a server, spending for the OS. So either I had to outsource some of it. So even before I can consider if this was going to be a real pilot project, right? I had to spend between 20 and 30,000, right, to provision these servers, and it would take some time. So creating like kind of like a skin on do you want Windows or Linux, right? How
That's right.
much memory, how much capacity, right? So I think a part that people aren't talking enough about is the level of innovation in startups and companies that were able to move at a much faster rate because they didn't have to wait for the funding, right? So the whole procurement side of it on the
Absolutely.
consumption model was big on that, right?
Totally total game changer. Back in the 60s, a very famous computer scientist, John McCarthy,
Hmm.
he said, if we have utility computing, that means computing on demand like the electricity grid, whole industries would be birthed because companies could subscribe to this utility and in turn, their customers would subscribe to them, which is
Right.
exactly what happened with Netflix. What do we pay Netflix? I don't know what we pay them, £15,
Yeah, yeah.
$15 a month, $20 a month, and they produce their shows and they themselves subscribe to AWS.
Right.
Now, in my book, I'm glad you mentioned this, by the way, and just for your listeners, we haven't
Mm.
prepared this. This is not a,
No,
I
no.
didn't ask you to ask this question,
Yeah.
but there's a great story, chapter 10, I think, where Mark Randolph, the founder, the first chief exec and the founder of Netflix, drove with his son from Scotts Valley to San Francisco. And his son had set up a website, he set up some payment, he set up some analytics. And the drive, I think, from Scotts Valley to San Francisco is 1 hour. And he said he was absolutely flabbergasted because Back in the day when they started Netflix, you couldn't ask for you'd have to ask for money in advance based on a
Mhm.
presentation, a spreadsheet, some numbers, and then if you got £1 million or 2 million, only then could you build a team, build the infrastructure, build the auxiliary software. In fact, you had to build everything from scratch. And he said the reason it changed the computing game and the investment game at the same time is because nowadays you don't need an investor to get your minimum
That's right.
viable product and your first 10 users. So you can show the investor, well, this is the traction I've got. These are the users. These are the downloads. Now, if you give me some money, we're going to be able to scale this far. The founders get to keep a little bit more of the pie,
Mhm.
but the investor has got more range of investments because these projects have all been de-risked. So the investment game and the software game were changed simultaneously by the cloud.
Yeah, no, this is good. Now, I want to get back to just a point that you talked about AI, being ready now and within 12 months or so being more impactful, right? One of the things that you've mentioned in the past, right, is that you said this before that cloud native isn't a silver bullet, right? And I think that's a good point, right? Are you seeing companies fall into the same trap with AI,
Yes.
treating it like magic rather than a tool? How should some of these leaders keep AI efforts kind of what I call grounded and purpose driven?
The problem is, so first of all, companies don't really make this mistake. People do, individual
Okay.
leaders. And so really it's a crime of wishful thinking.
Hmm.
And it's wishful thinking from managers who should really know better. And what I always like to say, what I see all the time, because obviously my phone does not stop ringing these days, from our customers who need advice. And the artificial intelligence and cloud computing, it's sexy, it's cool, it's interesting. And this is going to sound terrible, Ray, but a lot of people want it on their CV. They come in, do an AI project, and at the end of the project, nobody can say it failed because everybody's going to get in trouble. So
Right.
then it all goes on the CVs. Yes, I've done an AI project for this big bank in the city of London, and then people move on. These are all the wrong reasons for choosing a technology. So I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. And that comes from managers who, frankly, have got big egos, not particularly
Hmm.
strong egos, have no doubt been promoted into their positions because they've got big mouths, not necessarily because they're putting their team first and the company and the shareholders first. So I think the wishful thinking element comes from people who do not understand the technology.
Right.
And there's something I always teach my executives, the people I'm helping, because they always want to go quick. They always want to go quickly and aggressively and go big or go home, they say. Now, okay, that's fine. But I tell them quick ramp ups are nearly always followed by embarrassing ramp downs. So do you want to do this quickly or do you want to do this properly?
Right.
And unfortunately, most people don't want to do it properly, and that's where, in my case, the conversation ends.
Right. Right.
So yes,
Yeah.
there's a lot of wishful thinking out
Yeah.
there. It's scary times, but we have to give in to that. Wishful thinking is about it helps your ego, but the reality is, if your people are not ready, if the safety isn't there to take risks, and frankly, if you don't have any data, most
Hmm.
data in most companies is scattered everywhere on bits of paper.
Yeah.
You can't train an LLM without training data.
Right.
So if you want to automate your HR processes, the first step on the journey is to get your data sorted. It's not sexy. It doesn't look good on your CV, but it's essential if you want to succeed with AI.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, I think one thing we see also is this whole financial planning and justification for AI when it comes to budgeting for AI, and we do a lot of business cases and stuff with a lot of different customers and economic models where we try to tell them to not fall in love with the technology, but be able to map any technology capability or feature to economic value, right? Now, how do these companies avoid the overspending hype or under investing because of fear, right? What are some of the financial planning for adoption looks like of this future that you see?
I think that's a great question. Do you know what's interesting? When executives are presented with a technology they don't understand, they often lose their minds.
Mm.
So if I was to say to a manager, it doesn't matter, where they're from, or I need you to implement a new HR system, or I need you to implement a new performance system, it would be dead easy for them. There's work out, well, what's the end goal? Well, first of all, what's the budget? What's the end goal? What are the alternatives? How can I look at them? How can I de-risk them? How can I run a pilot study? And if the pilot works, how can I scale it? These are just very normal things. Now, when you say to somebody, oh, we want to introduce AI into our company,
Right.
all of a sudden they're talking about, oh, we need to build up an AI center of excellence. We need to change our hiring. We need to speak to Oxford University, and we
Yeah.
need to get the best graduates. So the real question is, what are you trying to achieve? So forget about AI,
Yeah.
forget about that. What is the business goal? Okay, the business goal is we want to expand into the Benelux. Okay, fine. How do we want to do that? Oh, we want to do that by, I don't know, improving our app, making it multilingual. Okay, fine. Is there anything in the tech stack, including an artificial intelligence tool, that might help us to achieve that? So as soon as technology becomes the goal, the ends, you've lost it.
Yeah.
So the technology is only a means to an end. People should understand their strategy, where they're going, what is it they're trying to do, and then work backwards from that. Which people do I need? What technology is available to me? Managers know how to do this. It's exactly the same process. So they just have to not get dazzled by the
That's right.
technology.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's great because we could probably have another session because I think it's perfectly in line with this whole framework that I've been talking to customers about. Don't ask me about AI, ask me about what challenges or opportunities you're considering, right? And working from that angle, which is good. I think another part is maybe to go a little bit deeper is some of these enterprise customers or even service providers, right? They have to make a decision, right? Do they do and we've seen this with cloud and other technologies about build versus buy, right? But in this case, is build versus buy for AI, right? Should companies try to build their own AI capabilities, or is it smart to use off-the-shelf AI services? And if you do that, right, what risk do you run if you outsource too much of it?
Well, you're not going to like the answer, but of course I'm a consultant, so the answer is it depends.
Okay.
But
Okay.
but I'll give you another example from London. At the end of our street, and I'll send you an email with the phone number later if you want to try it.
Sure.
At the end of the street, there's a hotel. I won't say what chain it is because I don't want to embarrass anybody.
Hmm.
But it's a global chain, and if you call it, the person answers the phone and says, "Hello, how can I help you?" And in the background, you can hear the restaurant, and you can hear sort of busboys doing whatever they do in hotels and restaurants. But it's not real. It's an AI
Right.
speaking to you. So it's basically some sort of text to speech script. And I actually started saying to her, "Are you an artificial intelligence?" And I swear to goodness, it got annoyed with me. It got annoyed with me and said, "I will transfer you to my manager." And then it transferred me to a human. Now, in the case of the hotel, they don't need necessarily for that use case to develop an AI capability. But
Right.
I'm quite certain they've got a good team that understands software as a service. And if I had to guess, they're using a number of Amazon's tools, text to speech, natural language processing, and stuff like that to automate one of the jobs at the hotel chain, which is to answer the phone. So, in the case of the hotel, yes, I definitely think it's a good idea to build a capability on how to use those tools.
Mhm.
Now, let's say you're a big financial institution and you want to have ChatGPT like functionality so that you can say, you can ask a system, hey, how many holidays does Jamie Dobson have left? Or can you tell me quickly what our diversity and inclusivity policies are? And hey, Ray is due to have a performance review. Can you please aggregate all of the results from his previous review and prepare me a script so that we can have a good conversation? Now, if you choose to use one of the cloud providers for that, you're giving them the whole, you're giving them the crown jewels. All of that data, right, will then be theirs, and they can use it to train their models to
Right.
help other customers. So yes, it might be good for society, but all of a sudden you've given away something that's extremely valuable in your own business's data, and you've let another company offer a massively valuable service based on that data.
Yeah.
So in that case, if the company was big enough, I would be thinking, well, we're going to be training our own LLMs on our data, and no, thank you, Siri, you ain't getting that.
Right.
So each of the use cases are different, and each of them are dependent, surprise, surprise, not on technology, but on the business need.
Yeah, no, this is good. Yeah, I think this is great because I think it's always a decision. Now, early on, you touched about, you know, the whole idea about the importance of data, right? And when I look at AI, I see it as three components. You have the data and looking to see the patterns, whether it's internal or external data that you have to extrapolate patterns. But there's also the infrastructure of how quickly, how secure, and how scalable, scale in and scale out the infrastructure is. And then you have the intelligence, which is, the different models like Falcon or OpenAI and stuff like this, right? So if we look at let's say this infrastructure first mindset, right? There's a lot of talk that is just focusing on these cool models, right? But how important is it having the right infrastructure, the data pipes, the cloud setup to actually succeed?
It's a bit of a multifaceted question, that one. So I
Yes.
think, so first of all, you do need data. So there's just no getting away from that. Artificial neural networks require training data. And the reason the whole world is up in arms right now is because of public data from Wikipedia. The publicly funded internet has been mined to train models that are benefiting commercial interests and not society. So obviously, people are rather annoyed by that. So yes, so there's no point saying, well, we're going to automate all of our processes internally if your data's a mess, because nothing will work. So whether or not you use your own infrastructure, or you use cloud infrastructure, or potentially you use a local data center that's not attached to the large cloud providers. So I think the data infrastructure is very, very important. Now, when we move over to application development and cloud computing, I think to me it's a bit of a hierarchy, and I get the feeling AI will sit between the infrastructure layers and the application software. So if you've got and you're paying for advanced services from Amazon that we spoke about that earlier, text or natural language processing, you're going to want to use that effectively. So you need
Mm.
to make sure that your applications are calling those services only when they need to, and you're going to want to make sure that you're not overspending on the cloud, and you're only sending the calls to the artificial intelligence services as you need them. So I do think it's important, but at the same time, I really get the feeling it might be possible to bypass the whole infrastructure thing.
Okay.
And it's moving so quickly that now very small LLMs running on quite small machines are producing good results.
Right.
So the truth is I think this is a mystery we haven't quite unpicked yet, and it's because the computer doesn't just change its own shape; it changes the shape of everything it touches. So
Right.
it's an extremely fluid situation right now.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer for that. I mean, I think it's an honest and direct answer, which is good. But um, if we look at kind of like AI's real limits, right? There's often a big gap, and I think for our audiences is important, right? It's that I often see a big gap on what AI can do in a demo and what it can do in the real world, right? So, how do these companies make sure they truly understand AI strength and the weakness before rolling it out, right? And reduce the risk of innovation in this particular case.
I mean, I would refer to my earlier answer. I mean,
Hmm.
any manager who falls for a demo or a POC is fooling themselves. And
Right,
again, if somebody was demoing a new account software, you would grill those people because it's a domain most managers understand.
right,
So I think the way to get around that is, first of all, to educate yourself, to understand what are the limits, to never forget the business goal. What is what is the business goal? And of course, software companies, they do two things. They will always promise massive gains, 100% gains, 500% gains, and that gets people excited. Well, we shouldn't fall for that. That's a magician's trick.
hmm,
And the second thing they love to do is to neg they're the potential customers. They tell them, well, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. Our pre-sales team will come in and they'll fix that and they'll teach you about psychological safety, etc., etc. And what happens when they've landed the sale is I get a call from some of these software companies that says, "Hey, Jamie, we've just sold this, we've just done a massive deal with this company, but now they need help with their culture, their systems, their continuous integration.
Yeah.
Could you come and help?" So I think we have to learn to see through that. That
Mhm.
comes back to, I hope it's not too boring for your listeners, Ray.
No,
That
no,
comes
no.
back to basic management. From a POC, we narrow down the range of options, but then after that, how does it apply to these use cases? And then after that, how can it be scaled across the wider um, organization? So
Mhm.
people must not fall for the smoke and mirrors of POCs.
Right.
Nice to be entertained, but let's let the rubber hit the road, and that's when you start to find out, is your strategy any good? Because if it can't be executed, then unfortunately it's rubbish.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I like something that I've heard you mention in the past, right? You have to go slow to go fast, right? I remember that message. I have it in quote, right? How should companies apply this mindset when rolling out these AI projects?
Well, that's a great one. Yeah, you've got to move fast to go slow. So typically, most companies go really quickly for the first 6 weeks, hit the bumps, and then they manage to drag out a a a project that really should have
Yeah.
lasted 12 12 months, but they've managed to drag it out to be, half a decade.
Hmm.
Um, did you ever come across Amy Edmondson? She's a Harvard
Yeah, I've
researcher.
heard the name. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
Edmondson researched psychological safety, and
Hmm.
in her latest book, Right Kind of Wrong: Why Learning to Fail Can Teach Us to Thrive, she
Hmm.
gives an example. It's a game called Electric Maze, and you can imagine a chessboard, but for
Hmm.
humans.
Right.
And it's maybe it's 6 by 6, 36 squares, something like that. And we work as a team. Maybe there's four of us, so it might be you and me, Ray, and a couple of our colleagues.
Hmm.
And the idea is to plot a path through electric maze.
Hmm.
Problem is some of the squares beep loudly, and they scare you to death when you stand on them. Uh, anyway, what happens is this: is if you're a computer programmer, you know that this is a logical search. You step on the first square, step on the second square, step on the third. Now, when it buzzes, the rules of the game are you've got to jump off and join the back of the queue and then help your colleagues get through. So obviously you say to the next person, well, it was the third one that buzzed, so you should be, avoid that one, step on the fourth.
Right.
Now, this is a logical sequential search into space.
Hmm.
But in real life, that's not what happens. You can solve the puzzle in about six or 7 minutes. In real life, people get nervous to step on the square. Their leg hovers and they think, oh my God, is it going to buzz? And their team is in the background with bated breath and they put the foot down and the square doesn't buzz. Oh, and everybody breathes a sigh of relief.
Right.
And then the process happens again. Well, all of that leg hovering is wasting time.
Yeah.
So somehow human beings have got a really good way of changing a game of logic into a game of emotions, of
Right.
changing what should be a normal process into a roller coaster of emotions, highs and lows like a baseball season.
Right.
Um, anyway, so the real trick to going slow is to remember the context, to understand at the beginning of a contact, at the beginning of a program, things are unknown, and your people are not won't have the skills. That's normal. So you test and you learn. You test and you learn. You make a big list of the big risks, 10 of them, and when you've started to answer those questions, okay, then you go from a team of 8 to a team of 12 to a team of
Yeah.
14. Those people present along the way. So what they're doing is logically and systematically exploring the space, the AI space, exploring if that use case worked and reporting back. And when they start to get comfortable, then we can start to put the afterburners on because we know where the buzzers are. We know what the risks were. We've got rid of a load of them. We've mitigated some more. And now we can start to go quickly. So you're searching that space in a logical way, exactly like you would search across electric maze.
Yeah, no, I love when I can get a Brit to use references to baseball. So my job is done if I've done more of that. So I love the example, right? But I think this psychological safety, the term in that area, it's an important one because it helps build that type of culture moving forward. But if we look at, whether they're in the process of considering building and they have certain implementations, right? There's this whole hiring and upskilling your group, right? And when you're building AI talent, right? Is it better to hire specialists or a squat team or train your current team? And how do you avoid hiring just because they have an AI in their resume or CV or something like that?
Well, that's easy to deal with. I'll come to that in a second.
Sure,
So again, the all of this wonderful new technology, we need to stick to the basics.
sure,
So strategic human resource processes are basically about asking what type of roles do I need now, or what type of roles do I need in the future. So you've got people here in London, and I've got no doubt over in the United States, hiring rock stars. They've done AI. He's a
yes.
rock star. She's a rock star. But unfortunately, Ray, it's nearly always a man, right? He's a rock star. Okay, fine. So this is ridiculous. This is absolute nonsense. The question is, what are we going to be doing in 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months? No problem. What are those roles? What are the responsibilities? What are the qualifications? How do we translate those roles
Sure.
into job descriptions? And how do we design a hiring process that makes sure all of those qualifications are tested? It's basic stuff. Can you imagine how embarrassing it is for me when I present to boards of directors with a CEO and a COO and a CTO, and they ask me, oh, how should we deal with these roles? And I'm like, exactly how you deal with them in a factory or in accounts. What do you need? Right? Now, then we get to the question, can we train everybody? Well, no, is the answer. I don't want to sound brutal, lacking in compassion, but the truth is that cloud computing and application programming and AI development requires a different skill set. The chances of all of your people being able to learn that is almost zero. Some of them will. So roles change. Some roles will be made redundant, and managers have got to have the courage and the compassion to deal with that properly. You need to understand your landscape. These are the new roles. Some people can train into that. These are maybe auxiliary roles, which are not the same as the AI ones, so somebody can, transfer. But you've really got to look at it from a strategic HR perspective and simply do it systematically. And companies know how to do that. But they again, when they hear those two initials, AI, and those two letters, they go a bit crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think and I mentioned this in other discussions about, having this need for a culture of innovation, right? To be able to do that. But and I see more of this in like the service provider, in the telco space where traditionally they're kind of like cautious organizations, right? Very risk adverse in that area. But one of the things I notice, and I don't know if you agree with this, right? It's some of these AI projects demand more of a what I call experimental, fail fast culture, right? And how does one make sure they don't become more experimentation and are able to get the value? Is it overall culture? What do you see from that side of
So,
it?
so this is the bane of my life, and essentially,
Okay.
it is my whole life's work.
Hmm.
The book I've just finished, Visionaries, Rebels, and Machines,
Hmm.
talks about creating the space for mavericks and allowing mavericks to do their job.
Okay.
So, in the post-war years, there were two organized, well, there were more than two, but in the US, the Department of Defense had RAND, Research and Development, and they had ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency. And I don't know if you've ever worked with the military or you have any
I
family
worked for
history.
the government. I did a lot of work for the feds and stuff like that there. So
Right, and so it was, the poor the poor U.S. military, they are regimented, strict, disciplined. They don't want no long hair and people wearing short sleeves and none of that nonsense. But they had to admit that technology and Mavericks had just kind of won the Second World War. And so through gritted teeth, they created agencies the likes of which had never been seen anywhere, let alone in the United States. And in those agencies, they placed people like Paul Barron, who more or less more or less invented the theory behind the internet. And they put into another position the head of command and control, a guy called Licklider,
mhm.
psychologists. These people were free thinking mavericks, and they went on to do amazing things. Now, this is a challenge for large organizations because the type of people who follow their own path, who take risks, who try things differently, are not drawn to large organizations.
Right.
So the biggest organizations, the ones who would benefit the most from AI, cloud computing, application development, who, in other words, would benefit from these mavericks, do not know how to create space for them.
Right.
And so it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And so how can we relax organizational controls? And Andy Grove, my hero, the former chief executive and chairman of Intel, used to say in times of crisis, in times of change, you have to let chaos reign. And then he would say, and after the crisis, when things come back down to earth, you have to reign in chaos. These were chapters in one of the books he wrote. So I think first of all, we have to acknowledge you may have great people in an established business, but they might not be risk seeking. Now there are ways to test for that. So you need to release your organizational controls. Some people there will be desperate to take risks and they've been wrapped up in red tape. Got to relax the controls, like Andy Grove said, bring in the mavericks, achieve what it is you're trying to achieve, and then bring back reign in chaos once things have got back to normal. The problem is things will never go back to normal. AI and technology supercharges itself. So for me, this is the greatest challenge businesses face right now today. How can we be controlled, be dutiful to our shareholders, and yet accept that we're going to need risk seekers and risk takers? And electric maze shows us one thing. If you're scared to put your foot down, it's because you work in a company that doesn't let you take risks.
Right.
Because I promise you right now, I would have no effing problem putting my damn foot down on electric maze.
Right.
It's a real issue. It's a huge issue. Maybe not just in our businesses, but maybe in society as well. How do we get our kids creating and stepping out of the box?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's brilliant, or as they say in the UK, lovely, right? That
Lovely.
you're touching on this topic because I think it's relevant for us to continue. Maybe, Jamie, we can close with, right, managing expectations around AI, right? And if, with all the hypes and fears, right, about AI, how should some of these leaders manage this expectation, right, inside their companies and with their board or their customers to keep more what I call a realistic, but still keep it exciting, right? When you have those type of mavericks coming in your organizations and stuff.
I think we need to be very honest. So we need to educate ourselves. And in my book, there's lots of reasons to be afraid, but one of the reasons to be optimistic and positive are the amazing conversations that are happening, including this conversation that we're having right now. Let's start with the scary. So when the radio was invented and it quickly bumped into the Third Reich in Germany, that technology was put in the hands of propagandists that really shaped public opinion about what was going on in Germany at the time. This is a great threat. Artificial intelligence can produce deep fakes, messaging, it can target people. So for governments that are about to misbehave or maybe are already misbehaving, AI in the hands of propagandists can be extremely dangerous, will be extremely dangerous. We have to be honest about that. Another thing we need to be honest about is roles will change. Roles and responsibilities will change. Some job categories will be made redundant. That's the negative, but other opportunities will arise. New jobs, new roles and responsibilities, that is going to happen. This is a chance to do things right without risk taking and creativity and spaces for a wide range of different people. You're never going to succeed with AI. I think the world will be a better place if we create space for mavericks and we bring in psychological safety so people can take risks into our organizations. I think that's going to make us better parents. And I know that you're a sports coach, and you must ask yourself, like I do, why don't we apply the same rules in work that we do when we're coaching the
True.
juniors? I coach under 12s and I tell them, take risks, be respectful,
Yeah.
don't do this. And if only my executives would listen to the same advice.
No. Yeah.
And so I feel, let's be honest, when we don't know, we need to say we don't know.
That's right.
That's important as well. But let's not be afraid.
Right.
The human race is a curious thing. we do terrible things to each other, but we do great things to each other as well.
Yeah.
We have to understand that human nature does not evolve as quick as technology. In fact, human nature barely evolves at all. So, how do we coexist with these godlike software tools and our ape-like mind? That will be the challenge for policymakers and for business leaders in the next, well, I was going to say the next 20 years, but I'm afraid it's probably more like the next 5 years.
5 years, right? Yeah, no, I think it's good. Good. I mean, and in sports at a young age, teaching them how to learn from their failures, we call it failing forward, right? And having this growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset, right? Which then translates into being impactful in the business world. Well, Jamie, I can't thank you enough for joining the podcast. This was very insightful, and I'm looking forward to hopefully having you again because I want to go deeper into one of these specific projects. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ray. I love that. I would love to come back and speak to you again. And I hope your listeners get something from this.
Great. With Jamie, this is Ray Mota. Thanks for joining this edition of the Deep Edge Podcast.